Well, thank you very much. I have never come out from behind a curtain before. I feel very honored here. And I hear that Chelsea Clinton was here, a few weeks ago or something like that. So I feel especially honored to be here. Thank you so much, Johannes and Nikolai, my colleague Drew at the Federal Reserve, for making this evening possible. And thanks to all of you who chose to come listen to me instead of stay home and watch the Pope. So I feel very touched that you're all here tonight. Before joining the Federal Reserve, I had the good fortune of working with President Clinton, with Senator Clinton. I was in the Oval Office when President Clinton signed the Assets for Independence Act into law, which created match savings accounts for low-income families, probably the highlight of my life and career. And then worked with Senator Clinton on this idea of baby bonds. When a child is born, he or she gets a savings account at birth, and with $500 that they can later use to go to college or start a business or buy a home. It didn't pass at the national level, but I'm pleased to report that it's making progress throughout the U.S. So anyway, I feel very privileged to be here and have always looked forward to it. I have to say, because I work at the Fed, these are my own views and not necessarily the views of the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. So let me begin with a story of two young adults. Okay, their names are Mackenzie and Troy. All right. So bravo to Mackenzie. When she was born, she wisely chose married, white, well-educated parents. She chose to live in a mostly white area with great public schools. She chose parents who read to her, signed her up for violin and soccer lessons at an early age, and involved her in her church and the local YMCA. She also chose her birth year very wisely, graduating from college and entering the job market as the Great Recession had as the recession had already recovered from the Great Recession. She chose parents who earned and saved enough for her to graduate debt-free from a private four-year college, giving her many career options and the ability to contemplate marriage herself and to save for her home and her own retirement. Because of all of her great choices, Mackenzie is likely to accumulate wealth over her lifetime. She is one in 4 Americans we can call thrivers. But too bad for Troy, who is just as bright as Mackenzie, but he chose non-white, non-college educated parents who never married. He chose a poor, highly segregated neighborhood with lousy public schools and few options for sports, for music, or civic activities. Troy's conscientious mother was too busy supporting her own parents and now her own kids to finish college, and is too busy working 2 part-time jobs to read to Troy or shuffle him around to music or sports lessons. She's also accumulating debts to family members and on credit cards just to stay afloat and manage the ups and downs in her financial life. Troy also chose his birth year very wisely, graduating from high school just as the Great Recession was getting underway, thus severely limiting his job options. Because of his great choices, Troy is not likely to accumulate wealth over his lifetime. He is among the 3 in 4 Americans we can call strugglers. All right. So the question I'm asking, are Troy and Mackenzie forever consigned to one of these 2 groups? All right? Is there a role for choice and human agency? Can they overcome the circumstances of their births and the choices they did not make? Is this not America? To address these questions, I'm going to discuss 4 key demographic drivers of family wealth: age or birth year, race and ethnicity, education and family structure, and then how 2 of those factors, education and race, interact. Then I will close with 5 things that I think matter for achieving financial security in the 21st century: demography, early investments, place, institutions, and hope. All right. So let me begin by talking about recent research that we've done at the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis about what drives family wealth, who builds wealth and who doesn't, who's likely to build wealth and who's not. And I'm talking about median net worth, I'm talking about averages. There are always exceptions to these numbers, but these are the overall trends. We are focusing on these particular drivers because they've turned out, we think, to be the most powerful predictors of who builds wealth and who does not. Not surprisingly, the correlations are very strong. People who are older, better educated, and white or Asian have significantly more wealth than those who are not, all right? So let's just start with age very briefly. Age, it turns out, we call this our most surprising finding. It's most surprising because it ended up being the most powerful predictor of who builds wealth and who does not. This is controlling for race, controlling for education. It turns out that, and this is not simply because older Americans have had more time to accumulate wealth than younger Americans. That part's pretty obvious. What I'm talking about here is something deeper and more historical. Older Americans today younger Americans today are on a path to accumulate less wealth than previous generations at the same age, all right? So an American born in 1970 is on a path to accumulate 40% less wealth over their lifetime than somebody born in 1940, all right? So, their incomes are higher, they're better educated, they've advanced in many significant ways, but their wealth is lagging behind, all right? Something deeper and more fundamental is going on. We have a generation of younger Americans who, for the first time, will not do better than their parents or grandparents in terms of building wealth. Education, we call this our most deceptive finding. The correlations are, in fact, very strong. On average, people with a college degree have about 6 times more wealth than people without a college degree. However, we have to be very careful here because correlation does not mean causation. In other words, having the degree itself does not directly or necessarily lead to building wealth. Okay? It turns out that there are many things associated with going to college and getting a degree that are also very strongly correlated with building wealth, such as your parents. Did you have an inheritance? Did you have grit and determination? Did your parents read to you? It turns out that all these things are really strong predictors of who goes to college and who does not, and not just necessarily who builds wealth and who does not. There are many other factors that determine who builds wealth and who does not. So we think of degree as kind of a marker for a lot of things, a lot of other things that a child or a young adult did right to build wealth. And the final one here is race and ethnicity. We call this our most persistent and our most troubling finding. In general, whites and Asians have about 12 times the wealth that blacks and Hispanics have, okay? Now, this has not changed in 25 years. This gap has not changed at all in 25 years. And that, again, is despite other gains, despite the fact that we have made historic gains in educational attainment, in voting rights, in political representation, in bringing down certain barriers in lending and mortgage practices. Despite all these things, African Americans still lag significantly, and Hispanics lag significantly in their ability to accumulate wealth. Clearly here as well, something else is going on. And these too can be traced back to some early factors. Were they read to? Were they, did they go to good schools? Good nutrition, early stimulation, and of course we cannot ignore the role that historical discrimination has played. The fact that African Americans were property let alone we're not able to accumulate property over many years, and in fact, and to this day, shows up in these very disturbing trends about wealth. In fact, in many ways, I think that a real measure of when we do something about racial injustice is when we actually see the wealth gap close, because it's wealth that is really a barometer of your total financial well-being. It represents the culmination of previous efforts from your family and others, and it also represents what you are able to do going forward. So these are three very strong predictors: age, education, and race, that we have data around at the Federal Reserve about who's likely to build wealth and who's not. Now, there's a fourth factor that is a little bit more recent, at least from our perspective, and that's family structure. Is somebody married or not? And here I'm largely relying on data that has come from other folks, since we don't have great data on this at the Fed. But this is increasingly recognized as a key factor in determining who builds wealth and who does not. I know you have some charts in front of you, but there's three really important takeaways here. If you are married, compared to being separated, divorced, widowed, or never married, there's a huge income boost, all right? Secondly, there's an even bigger wealth boost if you are married. And third, these correlations hold true regardless of your education level. So there's a huge bonus, economic bonus for marriage, for college-educated people, but also for people who never completed high school. Unfortunately, and I'm only speaking about economics here. I'm not talking about the morality of marriage and single-parenthood. I'm only talking about the economics. There's been a huge rise in single-parent families over the last two generations, since 1950. If you look at the numbers, they're really quite remarkable. If you look at college-educated single parents, in 1950, they were 5%, okay? Fast forward to today, 8%, all right? But if you look at non-college-educated parents, they have risen. I'm talking about the population of single-parent families here. If they're non-college-educated, they used to be 19% of the population. Now they are 67% of the population. All right? In other words, we went from, in 1950, 1 in 5 non-college educated parents having a child without being married, to having 2/3 of non-college educated parents having a child while not being married. And surprisingly, the growth over these last couple of decades has been entirely among white families. In other words, this is not a race issue. This is a class issue. And this is something that Robert Putnam, in his new book, Our Kids, talks quite a bit about. As a matter of fact, he talks about kind of a new economic divide in America, a new class divide between the 1/3 of families whose parents are both college-educated and married, and the roughly 2/3 of families whose parents are not married and not college-educated. This is the new fault line, the new economic fault line in America that he's talking about. Those kids, those 1/3 of kids whose parents are educated and married, their prospects for moving up the ladder are quite good. For the rest of these kids, it's not so good. And this is rather disturbing. It's quite disturbing. The other piece of research I'll talk about in a minute is from a researcher named Raj Chetty, who's been really doing great work on economic mobility. What's the likelihood of a child moving up the economic ladder when they reach adulthood? And Chetty found 6 different predictors of upward economic mobility. I'll talk about those in a minute, but the strongest predictor of economic mobility was family structure. And by this, I don't mean whether or not a particular family was a single-parent family or not. What he was talking about is, does a child grow up in a neighborhood with a large fraction of single-parent families? If the larger the share of single-parent families in the neighborhood, the less likely a child was to move up from the bottom 20% to the top 20% everywhere in the country. All right? Now, as researchers, we have to be careful about what's driving what. It is true that people who are economically successful are more likely to marry anyway, right? We don't know if that's what drives marriage or marriage is what drives economic success. It actually does work both ways. But what I think is very clear is that single-parent families result from and contribute to declining economic mobility in the U.S., and for that reason, it's something that we have to pay more attention to as we think about giving more Americans a shot at the American dream. And let me just caution here, this is very important. This is nothing against single-parent families and moms. You know, I was raised by a single parent. My folks divorced when I was 3 years old. It was very hard for my mom. And many, like my mom, most work hard and are doing the best they can to raise their kids. The simple issue is this. In this economy, it is very difficult to raise a child and succeed in this economy with one income and one balance sheet. There is not enough time and there is not enough money to raise successful kids on one balance sheet and one income in this economy, and that is the issue. That is the issue, all right? So the next thing we did is we tried to put two of our drivers together. So we put together race and education and wanted to see what happens to wealth if you look at these two things together. I think what we've done here is kind of pose the question, is education the great equalizer in America? And I think the answer is not necessarily and probably not in and of itself, all right? Now, as I mentioned, the correlations between having more education and having more wealth are very strong, okay, about 6 times. However, if you look at the change in wealth levels over the last 25 years, the results are very, very different. It's a very different story. Whites and Asians have dramatically increased their wealth since 1992. 86 and 89% respectively. Okay, college grads who are white and Asian have increased their wealth, you know, almost doubled their wealth since 1992. And they are doing much better in terms of wealth than non-college educated whites and Asians, all right? Perhaps that's not surprising. However, if you look at blacks and Hispanics, they who are college educated, they have had significant wealth declines since 1992, okay? And it turns out that non-college educated blacks and Hispanics did better over those 25 years than college educated blacks and Hispanics over those same years. So in other words, college predicted building wealth for Asians and whites, but predicted losing wealth for Hispanics and blacks, all right? You're saying, how could this be, right? How could this be? Well, the data don't tell us exactly, but here's what we think is going on. 2 big things, well, 3 really. First is home ownership. Because African Americans and Hispanics had higher incomes because of their college educations, they were more likely to buy a home, qualify for financing. But also because they were black and Hispanic, they were more likely to be targeted for predatory loans and to live in neighborhoods that were not necessarily accumulating wealth, all right? Their homes didn't appreciate as much as others. So when the recession hit, they not only lost the value of their home, but that debt stayed on their balance sheet, all right, which was a double whammy to their net worth. At the same time, they were to get those degrees, they were more likely to finance their college degrees with student loans, right? The data are pretty clear on that. And those degrees were not necessarily as wealth building as other degrees, and they were more likely to default on those student loans. And just as a quick aside, it turns out that student loans have a they have a ripple effect on harming your balance sheet. There's studies showing that if you look at 2 families that are identical, 2 college-educated families that are identical, the one with student loans on their balance sheet has 6 to 7 times less net worth than the family that has no student loans on their balance sheet. That's because when you have a student loan, it displaces your ability to buy a home. It displaces your ability to save for retirement. It displaces your ability to start a business. It displaces or delays your opportunity to get married and build wealth through marriage. So you can see that, student loans, the effect of student loans are far more significant than the actual numbers themselves. The third thing that we think was going on to explain these discrepancies in the outcomes is African Americans and Hispanics simply had way more debt, other debts on their balance sheets, and a lot less liquid savings to buffer against some kind of an emergency. So I want to pose a question. Does this mean that we do not pursue homeownership and education for minority families? Absolutely not. It does not mean that. That is not the message, all right? But there is a very important lesson here, because historically, college and homeownership are the paths to long-term wealth accumulation if pursued under the right circumstances. However, the key lesson here is that how you finance an asset is just as important as the asset itself. You cannot divorce these things, okay? We have to take the debt side of the balance sheet much more seriously than we used to. All right, I'm going to shift to the second part of my talk, and here I'm going to talk about the 5 things that I think matter for building wealth and financial security in the 21st century. The first is, not surprisingly, demography. So I think it's always been true that the year you were born, who your parents are, your race, your education, these things have always mattered as to whether or not you build wealth. I think what we've learned from our research is that these things matter more. It now matters more, when you were born, who your parents are, and the color of your skin. In other words, the returns for having white, well-educated parents and being born at the right moment in history have increased. It's like a tailwind in your efforts to build wealth and financial security. At the same time, the penalties for not having those attributes have increased as well. It's like a headwind as you go about your life trying to build savings and wealth. And in fact, we've documented a pretty massive shift along these demographic lines away from strugglers and towards thrivers in just one generation. Thrivers went from having 45% of the nation's wealth to having 2/3 in just 25 years. Okay, very, very different. What I think this means is that we have to go well beyond income in targeting scarce public resources. But we also have to redouble our efforts to help minority and less educated families move forward. It's a lot harder now if you don't have an education and if you're a minority to move forward in this economy. And the third thing I think we must do is rethink the social contract. Right now, it's very heavily tilted towards the end of life. We need to have similar investments at the front end of life as well, right? What more can we do to invest in kids early in life so that they have a better chance at economic success? And indeed, the social contract depends on the ability of young workers to support older workers, right? We all know that. That's the way it works. However, we already have fewer younger workers to support an aging generation. We can't afford for those younger workers to be weaker economically as well. Second thing that matters, early investments. Not surprising, given what I said a little bit earlier. It turns out from a lot of other research, including some of the research at the St. Louis Fed, whatever inequality you're talking about, income, education, wealth, there's a pretty clear pattern emerging. The seeds of those inequalities are planted pretty early in life, all right? And it turns out that most of the patterns that lead to inequality later in life are probably pretty set by the time kids get to kindergarten, all right? Again, did your parents read to you? Did you have good nutrition? Did you get exposed to music and sports, right? How many words did you hear? You'd be amazed at how these seemingly small things early in life end up having a huge effect on brain development over the life course. It's really remarkable. And as I mentioned earlier, Bob Putnam's book, Our Kids, who talks about this divide between married and well-educated parents and those who are not married and not well-educated. He documents in his book, one study after another showing this, what he calls scissor graphs, this huge divergence between the outcomes of kids whose parents were married and educated and the kids whose parents were not. And on all these measures, were they read to? Did they have involvement in sports and music? Were they involved in their community? Did they have good nutrition? The paths diverge enormously. It's really remarkable. So, the good news here is that we now know this. We know that early investments really matter. Those of you looking at the graph can see this chart here by James Heckman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, showing the returns on human capital investments. And what he's found very clearly is that the earlier in life you make these investments, the greater the returns to human capital, the greater the return on investment. And it turns out that the biggest payoff are for prenatal investments, and the lowest return on investments are for those that start after somebody has graduated from high school. Okay, the curve is very, very clear. Earlier is better. And Putnam has this one statistic that if you just insert $3,000 over the course of 5 years in somebody's life, in their first 5 years of life, their SAT points go up 20 points later in life, and their incomes go up by 20% later in life as well. Small interventions early in life have very, very big payoffs later in life. The third thing that matters is place, neighborhood, right? Now, those of you who are following along, you can see this heat graph here, this big map of the US. This is something that Raj Chetty and his colleagues put together. And what he's showing is the likelihood of a child moving from the bottom 20% of the income spectrum to the very top as an adult. Okay, what's the likelihood of that happening? The darker the region, the less likely the child is to move up. As you can see, here in Arkansas, we're not doing so well, not so well in St. Louis either, but in other parts of the country, they're doing quite well. What's really remarkable here is how much economic mobility rates vary from one part of the country to the next. As a matter of fact, in the most highly mobile parts of the country, like parts of Utah, for example, the rates are 13 to 17%, which matches the rates in the most developed countries around the world. In the places with the least economic mobility, the rates are anywhere from 2 to 7%. These are among the worst rates throughout the world. So, there's enormous variation, and even within metropolitan areas, there's a lot of variation from one county to the next. Now, Chetty said that there are six things that predict whether or not a family moves up the economic ladder, all right? The first is segregation. If you live in a highly segregated neighborhood, you are less likely to move up the economic ladder. If there's a lot of inequality, you are less likely to move up the ladder. If the quality of your schools, K through 12, is not good, you are less likely to move up the ladder. If there's low levels of social capital, networks, and relationships, you are less likely to move up the ladder. If there are not unions, like workers' unions, you are less likely to move up the ladder. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, and most powerfully, family structure. If there is a large percentage of single-parent families in a neighborhood, any child in that area is less likely to move up the economic ladder. So the good news coming out of Chetty's research is that the earlier a child is exposed to a better neighborhood, the more likely he or she is to move up the economic ladder. They were able to track kids that moved from a low mobility area to a higher mobility area and found very compelling evidence that the earlier you move, the more likely you are to move up the economic ladder. So once again, I'm saying that place matters, but this is also another way of saying that early investments also really matter too. The earlier you make these interventions, the earlier a child is exposed to a good neighborhood, the better. So fourth is institutions. So let me start by talking about institutions by describing an era in history to you, okay? In this era, there was rapid technological change, stunning advances in science, rising fundamentalism, gaping inequality, massive consolidation among corporations, networks of violent non-state actors, a new era of infectious disease, a healthcare crisis, a well-organized lobby on behalf of the elderly, widespread predatory lending, and a new form of energy sources and mounting concerns about the environment. Does that sound familiar? Does it sound like our era? Yes. Turns out that that was a very brief description of some of the challenges that were faced in the progressive era, the 30-year period that began roughly in the early 1890s. Now let me tell you a little bit about what they achieved. They reformed the healthcare system. They dramatically reduced rates of infectious disease. They regulated, they came up with a regulatory regime for Wall Street without any taxpayer bailout. They stopped predatory lending. They created the Consumer Protection and Safety Movement. They instituted the progressive income tax system. They engineered a massive conversion to a cleaner energy source. They universalized public education. This is where high schools came from, everybody. They installed an ethic of conservation and public service. Here we are at the Clinton School for Public Service, and they left no legacy of public debt whatsoever. These were stunning achievements in light of what they faced. The challenges they faced are very similar to the challenges we face today. The reason I mention this is because at the heart of progressive era reforms were institutions. They built institutions that made it possible for people to succeed. They changed the course of history. They retarded economic inequality and terrorism and terrible outcomes on public health, predatory lending, because they built the kinds of institutions that made it possible for people to thrive economically. They institute credit unions, thrifts, progressive income taxes, financial education in high schools. They instituted a whole range of these. The Federal Reserve System, was created back in that era as well. This institution building was really key to their turning around what seemed like a very daunting situation. Finally, the last thing that matters is hope. So I think the point of paying attention to demography, to early investments, to place, and to institutions is to make it more likely that more people will make more good choices. In my view, public policy must compensate for the choices Troy did not make. His birth year, parents, race, the neighborhood, the schools he started in. Policy has to compensate for people like Troy so that he has, and people like him, have a better shot at achieving the American dream. But of course, policy can only go so far. Policy, it can take him to the water, so to speak, but it can't make him drink. Troy and others have to make the choice to embrace the opportunities that are offered to him and people like him. And Troy is more likely to seize those opportunities if he has some hope, some sense that a brighter future is possible. Indeed, there's a book by David Brooks called On Paradise Drive, where he talks about the essential American character is this notion of always peeking over the horizon, living over the horizon, that a better life always awaits me, is always something to look forward to. Well, we now have evidence, real hard evidence, that assets, wealth, play a unique role in instilling that sense of hope in children and families. In the U.S., Michael Sheridan, the scholar who came up with this whole idea of building wealth for low-income families, talked about hope as assets as hope in concrete form. The basic idea is that if you have an asset, you have a savings account, you're more invested in your community, in your future, in your family, in your country, and you're more likely, because of those assets, to think ahead and to plan ahead and to imagine a future that you otherwise could not. Because assets, they represent some future opportunity. We actually have evidence that if you look at kids who have $500 or less in a savings account, all right, a college savings account, and you compare that to kids who have no savings account, no college savings, the kids with the savings accounts are 3 times more likely to enroll and 4 times more likely to graduate from college. Okay, a simple $50 savings account gets them to think and imagine a future that they would otherwise not imagine, all right? It gives what researchers call a college-bound identity. Their identity changes because they know they are somebody going to college, okay? The community thinks of them differently because they know that kid is going to college. And because of that future orientation, they are likely to change their behavior in the present, take harder courses, make consumption sacrifices, work harder in school. It's really clear that even very, very small amounts of assets give kids a sense of hope, that they have a brighter and better future, and it changes their orientation now. We also have experimental evidence, randomized controlled experimental evidence, that a simple savings account raises mothers' expectations for their children's educational well-being, and it also improves the mother's psychological health. I'm pleased to report, as I mentioned earlier, that we're working on these policies all over the country to give kids these savings accounts so they can have a better opportunity. But this experience is not just limited to the U.S. Around the world, a group called BRAC has something called the graduation program. There's a group called Trickle Up, which I know that Johannes is familiar with. And they're working in India and Ethiopia, Ghana, and all over the world. And there the assets are not savings accounts. What are they? They're bees, they're goats, they're cows, and they're chickens, okay? And they found in these countries that when these families have the opportunity to have these assets, these animals, these insects, they are much more likely to work harder and to save more and to think about their future. In fact, what assets do, is make people believe that a different life, a different future is possible, and they can change their life in the present to make that future life possible. And I think we can't do enough, in my view, to ensure that more kids and more families have assets in the U.S. And around the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ray, for that. We do have time for some questions. If you raise your hand, we'll get a microphone to you. Annie, I'm waiting on. Do you want to go first or second? You want to go first? Oh, okay.
I listened very carefully, and I rushed over here from one of the richer families in this country, the Rockefellers. I want to ask you the question that will have a twofold purpose. I listened for the public policy that will change these demographics. And I know that public policies around redlining, around entitlements, and I want to give an example of entitlements where I'm talking about discriminatory public policy leaders from the nutrition that you talked about. I have felt for a long, long time that the negative public policy discriminators, they knew nutritionally when they were giving people commodities. People thought they were helping, but those families in those demographic areas are the ones who have high blood pressure, diabetes, because those commodities are the very thing that you should not have eaten, but you were given those, and you got those because you had given the big pharma to grow them and then give them away to this demographic. What is your research that says that what I just said is not true?
Well, I can't comment specifically on poorly targeted food subsidies to the populations who need them the least. That happens a lot on Native American reservations as well. It's a disgrace. But I can tell you this, that there is, unfortunately, I think, a pattern of expecting the people least capable of handling any kind of intervention, the greatest responsibility to do something about it. So let me just give an example in the financial services area. How is it that low-income people who do not have employers with 401k plans are less likely to take the home mortgage interest deduction, least ability to save? How is it that they face an institutional landscape that wants to deplete their wealth? Payday lenders, check cashers, and others, right? So, and yet at the same time, we expect those people to behave in a way that will build wealth. We just give them financial education and they'll kind of do the right thing. I don't think it works that way. You know, you have institutions that behave to help people build wealth or build health, and you have institutions that deplete people's health or their wealth. The problem is the very people who need the wealth-building institutions face the ones that are wealth-depleting. And so I think a lot of the work that we do in this field is trying to turn that around. And if many of you are familiar with behavioral economics, nudges, trying to do small changes to get people to change their behavior, I think we have to have a revolution here. We need to have more wealth-building and health-building institutions in low-income and minority communities to make it easier for them to make the right choices.
Coming behind you, Frank.
Mr. Boshara, I was wondering if in your meetings at the Federal Reserve you ever considered this situation. At the beginning of the 20th century, this country embarked on an industrial revolution that's never been seen in history. Steel industry led to the growth of two big industries, automobiles and airplane manufacturing. We needed people. We welcomed immigrants who went to these factories, like my father in Detroit with Ford. In today's world, it seems that technology is doing the reverse. It's doing away with jobs. So how do you adjust college education to meet the marketability of the marketplace and incorporate it in your policies?
Well, it's not an area of research that I've ever conducted. I couldn't give you the specifics, but I can make a couple of comments, and maybe Drew would want to comment on this as well, if he would like. I think, you know, you're absolutely right. Jobs are being lost to technology. Capital flies all over the world looking for good deals, cheap labor, cheap money. I think that's absolutely correct. I think there's a lot of things we need to do. We certainly need to. The best idea that I've heard is to do a better job of high schools. High schools, either you're going to college or you're not, and there's absolutely nothing in between. We need to do a much better job, and again, starting earlier in life, to train kids for jobs in industries that are growing in the U.S. and train them for jobs in the tech industry as well. We need to create a pipeline like they do in Germany so that kids coming out of school who are not college-bound can go into productive industries. There are jobs in the tech industry, but they say they don't have enough skilled workers, right? We need to create those workers. I also think we need to do a much better job on immigration, letting more skilled workers into the country who can help grow the economy. But, you know, first and foremost, I think, you know, the real challenge is to create a much better training and program for kids starting very early on so that they have opportunities when they finish school. But you know, you've hit on a really important issue, and you know, my view is I don't think wages are really going to be. It's hard to imagine wages going up in any significant way like they used to. I think we have to think of other ways to compensate for the fact that wages are probably not going to grow like they used to. That's just the reality of living in a world with a lot of technology and with capital flying all over the country, all over the world. So we have to do a better job to compensate for that.
Drew's going to say something real quick.
Oh, yeah.
So Ray does asset building for the Federal Reserve. I do community development, so I go out and talk to communities and jobs and wages and all that kind of stuff. So I'm looking at that type of research. One of the things, I just wrote an article, we haven't published it yet, but it's about global workforce development, talking about global workforce development systems and which ones we're implementing in the United States and just kind of how that works. But one of the resources that I used for that was from Oxford University in the United Kingdom. And if you go to like their Martin School of Programs, there actually is a U.S. Study that they did on jobs and which ones were going to be automated. And apparently they looked at and they said 47% of the jobs currently in the United States could be automated at some point in the future. They didn't say that they were going to be automated, they just said they're at risk. And what they did is they put them into low risk, middle risk, and high risk jobs of being automated. So I would look at that report because it's very interesting. They used ONET codes, which are occupational codes. They looked at 700 occupations in the United States to talk about that. They did go through history talking about how, you know, you have certain jobs that go away and then something that replaces that. But what they looked at, they said in the 90s, was you had a lot of middle skill occupations go out. And that's, you know, a lot of the economic turmoil that we're in and losing some of those middle wage jobs. And they said basically what is going to be the next thing is low skilled jobs are going to be automated, and that's really what is at the higher risk. The less cognitive ability, the more repetitive a job is, the more likely it will be to be automated. The more cognitive a job is, the less likely it will be to be automated. And I'll say too, I went to high school in Pittsburgh. My dad worked for a steel company in Birmingham and also in Pittsburgh, and you've seen Pittsburgh really reinvent itself around healthcare, and Birmingham do the same thing around healthcare to try to reinvent their economy. But go to Oxford University's webpage. It's a really good resource on exactly what you're talking about.
Thank you, Drew.
Go here, and then we'll come on this side, in the back.
Hi, my name is Tamika, and I drove 3 hours here to hear you speak, and I'm so glad I did.
Oh, that's very kind of you. Thank you.
So I have a personal story that dovetails into your conversation today. I have a friend named Megan. She was Mackenzie, and I was Troy.
Oh.
My friend Megan, you know, her parents were married. We both went to Iowa State University, both got our degrees from there. She got hers in HR. I got mine in engineering. And so I'm thinking, well, I got my degree in engineering. It's a high demand job. Of course, I'll get hired. But what she had was connection. Her dad was a part of a staffing firm, and her mom was a professor at Iowa State University. My mom was a first generation college graduate from UAPB, but she got her degree in child care. So I see the connection, you know, I felt like I had hope. So in your last statement, you said we all should have hope, but the opportunity was not there. In my county, Mississippi County, we have the second largest steel producing county in the nation. And when I was to go back home to try and get a materials engineering job, a metallurgy job there was no opportunity. So my question is, how do you see that we can build up opportunity? You know, after folks get hope, we go and we get degrees, but there's no opportunity. And so then we still fall back in those categories of strugglers. And that's where I find myself. So what's your thought about that?
Yeah, it's that's the big challenge, of course. I think you know, part of what I'm recommending is that if we make more investments earlier in life, kids will have more opportunities that they otherwise wouldn't have. And I also believe that it's not really what the Fed does, but I do think that policy has a huge role in creating the kinds of investment that create more opportunities for people to work. It's beyond my comprehension, and again, I'm totally speaking off the record here, why there hasn't been a massive investment in roads and bridges and infrastructure and schools, which would create all kinds of opportunities for people who are ready and willing and eager to work. You know, the money has been cheap to borrow. The deficits are relatively low by historical standards. So I think it's kind of what the progressives did. They reimagined what was possible. They made public investments. They protected small farmers and entrepreneurs. They built these institutions that made it easier for people to move forward. They protected a way of life from large economic forces that were threatening that way of life. I don't think it comes entirely from government investments, but I also think when you're talking about the scale of the challenge that we have right now, it's hard to imagine it happening without some kind of large government investment, to make that possible. One of the reasons we talk about assets too is if you have assets, you can create opportunities that otherwise might not exist. Further education, further skills, start a business. You can imagine and do things that otherwise you couldn't do. So early investments in assets hopefully will create more opportunities later in life.
Joyce, you still have one?
I was really interested in what you said about place and segregation. And I think we socialize our kids, although we say we believe in integration, we socialize our kids to live segregated lives because we're not intentional about changing it. So I'm just wondering, are there some places that could be held up as models for us where the government, but along with individuals as well, are making choices not to say one thing and live another by deliberately living in integrated neighborhoods where we're not divided by class. In other words, kind of mixed income. Is there anything out there like that to fulfill my dream that I'm having every night?
Parts of Washington, D.C., where I spent 20 years, had a lot of very integrated neighborhoods. And they actually did pretty well on the heat map that Chetty and his team put together. And I think DC is a place, for example, that has made great choices in trying to promote all the things that predict upward economic mobility. My kids grew up in DC public schools. They were minorities in that school. Their teachers and principals were African American. When we moved to St. Louis, they were in shock. They were completely segregated. St. Louis is one of the most segregated cities in the country, and they feel it, and they don't like it. But they grew up with something different, and I'm grateful that they did. And I think there are other Washington, D.C.s out there, that have made conscious, deliberate efforts to integrate across classes. And, the data are very clear, not just from Chetty's studies, but others, that, mixed income neighborhoods, mixed race neighborhoods are overall economically better, safer, and tend to thrive.
Yes, sir.
I'm looking at the fact that place matters and noting that you talked about institutions also matter. And I'm looking at the heat map here, and it would suggest that in the Southeast, that place trumps institutions. Is that right?
Well, let me put it this way. They are less likely to have the kinds of institutions that lead to upward mobility, the quality schools, the employers that offer retirement plans or have unions. The churches, the community institutions that lead to social capital, so I think that's basically correct. There are certain institutions that exist at the community level, that really do matter for upward economic mobility. So I think your inference is totally correct. If you read Bob Putnam's book, he actually goes through schools and communities, the ones that matter, the ones that don't, the churches that make a difference and the churches that don't. So yes, a lot of the things that Chetty talks about mattering for economic mobility really are, in fact, the quality of the institutions, that exist, in those areas.
We have time for one more, Dan.
Hi.
So I think you're speaking to a very sympathetic audience here, but of the policy prescriptions you laid out, which of those do you see actually being politically palatable in a place like Arkansas or passing through the federal government at this point, at any point in the near future?
Yeah. Well, I think, let me just mention two briefly. I think anything that revolves around expanding and leveraging the earned income tax credit has a lot of hope. It has a great bipartisan history. Recent experiments have leveraged the tax time moment into savings opportunities. Great experiments all over the country that make it easy for people who receive a federal tax refund to do that. If you can enhance the federal tax return, tax credit with a local one, that's even better. And so there's even a record, even in this Congress, of trying to protect and expand the earned income tax credit. So I would think about that more than, in some ways, that might be more effective than trying to boost the minimum wage, for example, or a livable wage, or trying to expand unions. I think politically, you're going to go further with that. The other is this idea of child savings accounts that I mentioned. When I worked with Senator Clinton on this idea, it wasn't just her. Believe it or not, we brought together Rick Santorum, Jim DeMint, John Corzine, Chuck Schumer, Jim Sessions, and Hillary Clinton together around this idea. And we're talking about a $40 billion idea over 10 years. Okay, conservative Republicans and liberal Democrats came together because they thought this is for kids, this is long-term savings and asset accumulation, which means smaller government later in the future, a sense of hope, a sense of ownership. It means financial literacy. You can organize financial literacy around these accounts, which is what schools are doing all over the country. I worked in Congress for 20 years. I never saw members of Congress come together around this idea than any other. And now in Maine, Nevada, Oklahoma, you're seeing statewide, citywide, and countywide efforts that sort of bridge political divides around this idea of giving every kid a college savings account. I'm working in St. Louis with the Ferguson Commission. They've proposed this idea. It's bringing a lot of different folks together as well. So I would think about those two interventions as being important and I think politically feasible as well.
I know many of you were here on Monday when John Hope Bryant was here. He runs an organization called Operation Hope,
Yes.
and this kind of builds off of a lot of these policy things, and I encourage you to go back and watch that online, and maybe we'll blend you guys together, because a lot of things that you're talking about
We know each other.
from the policy side is what they're doing, and so if you want a real-world example of some of the things that are happening, he's an organization that's doing that. Thank you, Ray, for coming to the Clinton School. Thank you, Winthrop Rockefeller and Arkansas Advocates, for helping us bring this together. And I appreciate you all coming out, and we'll see you at the next one.
Thank you.